And Gord, I just like to acknowledge all the work that Gord has put in this organization. He's been co-chair of the program committee, so he and Judith solicited all the sessions, and of course, when those come in, then solicits the abstracts, and then has the enormous fun of putting all those abstracts into sessions, and they've done a tremendous job. I find it truly outstanding that out of nearly 400 talks, we only ended up missing, not receiving and not hearing word on I believe we're down to 2 presentations. And a lot of that is thanks to the persistence of Gord. So with that, I'll turn it over to Gord to introduce our plenary speaker.
Thanks very much, Noel, and for those kind words too. It has been quite a year, and I want to extend my thanks to Ed as well, because Ed did tremendous effort in leading IAGLR through a remarkably tumultuous year, as Paul just indicated in the comments. Who would have ever thought we'd have to have done 2 IAGLR conferences virtually? And I think Ed set a pretty high standard last year, and we strove to meet that as well too. And thanks to all of the members of the program committee and certainly our student volunteers in especially navigating what were some unexpected slight Zoom challenges yesterday and getting going. But everybody has done admirably well, and it's been a great conference to date so far. It's my pleasure to welcome our Thursday plenary speaker here at IAGLR 2021, is Dr. Sam Mason. When Sam was first invited as our plenary, her first comment to the nominating committee was that IAGLR remains her favorite conference and one that she regularly attends every year. And I think one important thing is, notably, it was here on the waters of Lake Superior that Sam recognized herself in her research transition from investigating the atmospheric impacts of forest fires in Montana to becoming a plastics pollution researcher. Sam was among the first to publish the widespread prevalence and impact of plastic pollution within freshwater ecosystems, and especially within the Laurentian Great Lakes. And that first research she did through the Five Gyres Institute, that publication itself has garnered over 700 citations to date. Her plastic pollution research in the Great Lakes also formed the basis for the Microbeads Free Water Act, which was signed into law by President Obama in December 2015. She's also been awarded the EPA Environmental Champion Award in 2016, Excellence in Environmental Research by Earth Month Network in 2017, and also the Heinz Award in Public Policy in 2018. She's currently a professor of chemistry and the sustainability coordinator at Penn State Behrend, located in Erie, Pennsylvania. She was previously a faculty member at the State University of New York in Fredonia from 2001 to 2018, where she also acted as the role in chair of the Department of Geology and Environmental Sciences. Sam has a BS in chemistry from the University of Texas, Austin, and she did her PhD in physical chemistry at the University of Montana as a NASA Earth Science Scholar. The title of Sam's plenary today is Bridging Knowledge Gaps in Plastic Pollution from Land to Lake and to Ocean. And just a reminder for everybody that's here today, what we'll do, we'll field questions for Sam's talk through the Q&A function down at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And Sam's going to speak for about 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll follow up with a question session following Sam's talk. So with that, I'll turn over the floor to Sam. And please, everybody, welcome Sam Mason as our plenary speaker.
Thank you so much, Gordon. I really appreciate the kind words. I appreciate all of your efforts and everybody at IAGLR to pull this together. As was pointed out, 2 years virtually is quite an achievement. It is such an incredible honor to be an IAGLR plenary speaker. I'm humbled for the opportunity to speak to you all today, even if we aren't in person. I'd like to start with what is typically the end of a presentation with the acknowledgements. The reason being that while much of the work I'm going to be talking about today is that which I was directly involved with, since that is the research I know best, I will also be relying on the efforts of an incredible group of people that I've had the privilege of getting to know over the past 10 years. Patricia Corcoran and I were the first to publish in this area of Great Lakes plastic pollution research, but we were quickly joined by Paul Helm and Chelsea Rochman, both of whom have written reviews on the topic in the past year, and upon which I'm going to be relying heavily in my plenary talk to you all today. In addition, Tim Holen, John Kelly, Steve Corsi, Alston Baldwin, Peter Lineker, Melissa Denheim, Matt Hoffman, Elizabeth Miner, Christy Tyler are some of the leading research scientists in this arena. And I am incredibly indebted to all of them and have the privilege to work with them. And while I mentioned the lead researchers, I want to also highlight the fact that, of course, all of these research professors have brought in a suite of student researchers, many of whom, if not all of whom, did the real work that we'll be presenting and talking about today. So I want to thank all of them. I'm sure I missed some names, and I also want to apologize in advance for those names that I did miss. It was not in my intention. There's just, as much as there's not enough of us, there's a lot of us.
Sam,
yeah.
We're not seeing your screen right now, so I don't know if you just want to check. Did you start sharing already?
I did. You're not
Okay.
seeing it at all?
No, it just stopped. Why don't you try re-sharing there?
Yeah, okay. Thank you for letting me know. Is that better?
Not yet.
Oh, well, that's very frustrating.
Yep.
Okay, I wonder if it's because I played with that stupid virtual background thing.
It was fun.
All right, we'll do
There
this.
we go.
There we
All right,
go.
it's working. We got it.
I don't like it, but all right, so here I am. But I don't know if I can, okay, so advanced down here now. Oh, and it took away all my animations. Okay, well, it is what it is. Okay. Okay, thank you for letting me know. So before we get into the weeds of the science, I wanted to start by, I think it's important to provide some context, as plastic provides a real paradox in the world of material science. As eloquently detailed in her book, Plastic: A Toxic Love Story, Susan Frankel reminds us that ironically, plastic was created because we were overusing natural materials. In the search for a man-made material that could serve as a replacement for natural materials, namely ivory that is used for billiard balls and piano keys, and tortoise shells that were used for women's hair combs, the first plastic, a semi-synthetic known as celluloid, was created. Given its volatility, which is not ideal when you're talking about jamming together billiard balls, and the labor-intensive nature of making products from it, celluloid only holds a modest significance in the world of plastic. However, it did launch the movement. You see, plastic is an incredible material. It is really, really strong, having strengths comparable to metals and ceramics, and yet it's really light. So in the chart on the right-hand side, you see that plastic relative is much lighter than things like aluminum, steel, or glass. So these two features make it really attractive as an industrial material. In addition, it's extremely moldable, so that you can contort it into a myriad of commonplace, super utilitarian items that are the very items Frankel uses to tell the tale of plastic's rise to prominence in her book. And this is exactly where we face our paradox. The versatility and the durability of plastic allows it to be used in place of natural materials, but these same features make it an environmental bane. Being synthetic, it is not readily oxidized as a food source by decomposers. Instead, it favors photooxidative degradation pathways, which largely take large items, breaking them into ever smaller pieces through mechanical abrasion. But not a whole lot is happening with regard to the chemistry of the polymers that make up the plastic. Being versatile, its use has grown exponentially, especially since the end of World War II, when the infrastructure for the mass production of plastic was put into place. To this point, we have now produced over 10 billion metric tons of this material, half of which has been produced just in the last 10 years. Kind of dramatic. Exactly how much is 10 billion metric tons? To give you guys some context, it's the equivalent of 1 million Eiffel Towers, 100 million blue whales, or enough plastic to cover an area the size of the country of Argentina ankle deep in waste. It's quite incredible. This dramatic increase in its use has been really pushed by marketing campaigns which focus on its disposability. This is an iconic 1955 Time Life magazine ad called Throwaway Living, the subheading, disposable items cut down on household chores. And so you really see through this ad how the focus is on the disposability, and it fuels this single-use throwaway society that we are now a part of. And it also leads to the increased loss of this material, whether intentional or unintentional, into the environment. For the record, the data seems to indicate it's about 40-60. So 40% intentionally, 60% unintentional. Oddly, even though we have certainly always produced waste in one way, shape, or form since our evolution, we don't actually keep very good data on waste generation. So now knowing exactly what happens to this 10 billion metric tons of plastic is not as easy to know as one might think. The best data that we do have, however, indicates that while a third of it still is in use, we still have produced 8 billion metric tons of plastic waste over the 70 years that it has been in use. Sadly, only 11% of it has been recycled, while more, about 15%, has been incinerated, leaving 74% that is discarded. Of this, 10 to 15% is best data we have indicates that somewhere between 10 and 15% of it ends up in our waterways. Put another way, more of it is lost to the environment than is recycled. The first report of plastic pollution in the peer-reviewed literature came in 1972 from Carpenter and Smith on studies they were conducting in the North Atlantic Ocean, not on plastic, but rather sargassum, with plastic simply as a bycatch. Despite this first publication, and with the exception of the Sea Education Association's collections in the 1980s, plastic pollution was not an area of active scientific research in any real way until Captain Charles Moore discovered and published the first accounts of the large accumulations of plastic debris in the middle of the North Pacific subtropical gyre in 2001. Maybe because it started in the oceans, maybe because of the sizes and counts of plastic debris, or maybe simply because of the dramatic visual impact that plastic has on oceanic creatures. But this is where the field was focused. It was focused on the oceans until about a decade ago, when a few researchers across the globe all seemed to have the same idea, to look upstream from the oceans into, yeah, if you can't see it, upstream from the oceans into the freshwater systems upon which we all, that link can and connect land to sea. And though you can't see it because it's in the background here, I was going to point out that this image that looks like it could be from like Bangladesh or something of all this litter in a river is actually taken by me here in Erie, Pennsylvania at one of our litter booms where we have our current research project going on. So this is where the real science of what I want to present to you will start. I will start with where the research started. I'm going to start talking about beach surveys that were done before moving into the open waters of the Great Lakes. We will then move upstream from the lakes into the rivers as a way to discuss a little bit about the paths that plastic flows as we move back out into the lake, this time in the sediment. And then we'll close out by discussing the impacts of this pollution, though we have few studies on biota from within the Great Lakes region in order to make reference. As a consequence, this will naturally lead us into talking about the current knowledge gaps in this field of Great Lakes plastic pollution. The first study of plastic pollution within the Great Lakes was a 2011 study from the Corcoran Research Group focused on the shorelines of Lake Huron. Though this image on the right is from a follow-up study in 2014, the same results were obtained, and that is a surprising number of pre-production pellets, often called nurdles, shown in the image to the left, along the southeastern shoreline of the lake with diminishing concentrations as you move northward. The Canadian Government National Pollutant Release Inventory website lists 18 registered chemical facilities specializing in the production of plastics located within the greater city of Sarnia at the southern basin of Lake Huron, the southern tip. So aside from this study just providing the first data on plastic pollution within the Great Lakes region, it also provides some important insights. Pre-production pellets continue to be an important source of microplastics, especially in shoreline environments near plastics manufacturing, such as in the city of Erie, Pennsylvania. Lake currents are also a dominant driver for the movement of plastics within the Great Lakes system, especially longshore currents that move things along the shore. A 2015 study from the Holland Lab, utilizing citizen science data from the Alliance for the Great Lakes Adopt a Beach program, provided additional data with regard to potential sources of plastic pollution, looking at 5 sites from around Lake Michigan. This study found that human population density was positively related to all the litter across all 5 sites, and that more than 72% of it was smoking or food related. The results indicated that the litter largely originated from activities occurring on or near the beaches, while other potential sources were minor. Expanding upon this same study idea, the Rochman Lab did a study using another citizen science litter program, Ocean Conservancy's International Coastal Cleanup. And this was released just this past year. Over 3 years, from 2016 to 2018, more than 3.5 million pieces of plastic were collected along the shorelines of all 5 of the Great Lakes, with the largest concentrations occurring in areas of population density, such as Thunder Bay, Ontario, Canada, and Duluth, Minnesota on Lake Superior, Chicago and Lake Michigan, Toledo and Cleveland, Ohio, and Erie, Pennsylvania on Lake Erie, and Toronto on Lake Ontario. Cigarette butts were the most numerous items, followed by tiny plastic or foam pieces. And of the remaining 10 categories, 7 are plastics related items. So these beach studies really provide us insight with regard to the sources of the plastic as it's making its way from the land into the water. And let's talk about the water. There are 7 studies total, including one that is currently in preparation and will be submitted to the Journal of Great Lakes Research come the first week of June when I get back from vacation, that have focused on the open waters of the Great Lakes. Starting up in Lake Superior, we see an average, these studies have revealed an average of 30,000 particles of plastic per square kilometer on the lake surface. Moving into Lake Huron, that average increases to 46,000. Geologically connected to Lake Huron is Lake Michigan through the Straits of Mackinac. In Lake Michigan, the average is lower at 17,000. that the water from Lake Huron flows into Lake Erie, where the average increases up to 160,000 particles. And then that water flows over Niagara Falls into Lake Ontario, where the average increases to a quarter of a million pieces of plastic per square kilometer. These studies tended to find higher counts when you're closer to the shoreline and closer to riverine inputs, lower counts in the middle of the lake where you've had more time and water for dilution. If we account for this lake surfaces, you see that we have somewhere between 1 billion and 4.5 billion pieces of plastic across floating on the surface of each of our 5 Great Lakes at any point in time. 97% of these particles are classified as microplastics, being less than 5 millimeters in size. Even further, 75% of them are less than 1 millimeter in size. Given that manta trawls, which are typically the nets that are used in these endeavors, has a mesh size of 1/3 of a millimeter, what we're saying is that 75% of the particles we've pulled out of the Great Lakes are between 1/3 of a millimeter and 1 millimeter in size. Only 2 of the 7 studies looked at particles that were smaller than 1/3 of a millimeter. They started at 100 microns, and so they found even higher counts in the 100 micron to 300 micron range. This makes sense because one big item can form, lots of smaller items and even smaller, right? You can get higher counts as you go to smaller size particles. In terms of morphologies, fragments were the most common type of microplastics morphology in all of the Great Lakes, with the exception of Lake Superior, where fibers are the dominant morphology. Pellets were a very common morphology within the lower Great Lakes of Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. These pellets might be the microbeads that were used to be included in some personal care products, or could be the larger pre-production plastic pellets that are associated with plastics manufacturing. There have been 3 modeling studies to date, largely coming out of Matt Hoffman's lab at RIT. His initial model, looking at all 5 of the Great Lakes and assuming inputs of plastic debris from gridded shorelines weighted by population densities, as evidenced here, and the yellow colors are higher population densities, approximated 10,000, move my head out of the way, 10,000 tons of plastic entering the Great Lakes every year. In spite of gyre structures in the mean current fields of several of the Great Lakes, there does not appear to be any stationary garbage patches like those found in the oceans, the kind of notorious Great Pacific garbage patch that's associated with Captain Moore's work in the North Pacific Ocean. Rather, while the circulation does have gyre-like motions at times and does lead to collections of particles, strong persistent winds break up these structures and send the debris onto the shore, often in a different state or country than the one that's generating it. This model did show good qualitative agreement between modeled and measured concentrations. So this is the comparison. At this point in time, only Erickson et al. 2013 had been published. The purple is the measured concentrations from that in situ study. The pink colors are the modeled concentrations. And so the closer that those 2 circles are to each other, the better the agreement. And you'll see with most of the 21 samples, they measured fairly well, except for in the eastern basin of Lake Erie. Looking at the models, what the model predicts, it shows that you get higher contributions. You would find higher abundances, shown in yellow, are predicted to occur in southern Lake Michigan, the western basin and south shore of Lake Erie, and the western portion and the southeastern shore of Lake Ontario. Good agreement between these, what would be beached particles, and the beach surveys that were done by Patricia Corcoran's research group on Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. So again, good model to measurement type of connections. Moving upstream from the lakes, we each venture into the tributaries that feed the Great Lakes. Working with the United States Geological Survey, USGS, we were able to sample 29 tributaries, accounting for 22% of the total water flow into the Great Lakes across 6 different states and under different land covers, different population densities, different wastewater treatment plant effluent contributions, and different hydrologic conditions. What we found was that within the Great Lakes, we have exponentially higher concentrations than what we see within the Great Lakes themselves. So here we're just comparing studies all done either in conglomerate in connection with my lab, honestly, just because we use the same methods, same mesh sizes of the nets. So what you see is much higher counts. Notice this is a logarithmic scale, much higher counts within the tributaries as compared to the other Great Lakes. Interestingly and unexpectedly, we also found very different morphologies within the tributaries as compared to the Great Lakes. So the tributary bar graph is the one on the right, and you see that it has much higher concentrations of fibers as compared to the Great Lakes studies. We hypothesized in this study that the reason might be that fibers are typically composed of negatively buoyant polymers, so things like polyethylene terephthalate and nylon, things that have a density that's greater than the density of water, greater than 1 gram per milliliter, and hence should sink in water, but that the turbulence of the rivers keeps them afloat. But as the rivers meet the lakes and that turbulence dies down, it allows the particles to sink. And we will come back to that idea in a little bit. Also giving us some kind of interesting analysis here is to look at the correlations of the morphology to the land use and the hydrogeology of when the samples were taken. And so that's what's shown here. I'm gonna move my head again. And I know that this is kind of busy. It's not gonna show it all, but let's kind of break it down. So the blue colors represent non-urban environments. The red colors represent urban environments. The pink shows low flow conditions, and the lighter colors show low flow conditions, and the darker colors represent high flow or runoff conditions. And then we have the different morphologies at the top. And what we see, it's not going to go through. What we see, and we see here with fragments, and then we'll show it with all the morphologies. Again, sorry, my animations are all gone. But we see that there is a correlation as we move from non-urban or more rural environments to urban environments. We see higher counts. As we move from low flow to high flow, again, low flow to high flow, we see higher counts. And so this really indicates that urban runoff is a primary pathway for microplastics. We see this with fragments. We see that same trend with foams, with films, and with pellets to a lesser extent, but still there. But we don't see that with fibers. And so for most morphologies, it seems that urban runoff is the dominant contributor to moving those particles from the land into the water. But with regard to fibers, it didn't matter. It didn't matter where we were. It didn't matter what the flow was. We always found fibers. And this really indicates a different source of those fibers. And we hypothesized that they were coming largely from atmospheric deposition, though we have no studies to date on atmospheric deposition within the Great Lakes. And it's one of those knowledge gaps. So we'll come back to that. Interestingly, there was no significant relationship to the percentage of wastewater treatment plant effluent contributions to the total flow for any microplastic type. Okay, so it didn't matter how much effluent there was, it didn't correlate to the different morphologies. And this is despite the fact that we had done an earlier wastewater treatment study where we collected 90 samples from 17 different facilities, and averaging across those facilities found that each facility was on average releasing over 4 million particles per day per facility. And there's 15,000 facilities across the United States. 60% of those particles are fibers. So this kind of really surprised us. It should be noted, however, that there are other studies in the Great Lakes region, namely those from the Holon and Corcoran labs, that have found statistically higher concentrations of plastic particles downstream from wastewater treatment plants as compared to upstream from wastewater treatment plants. A very recent study from Gerbic from the Rochman lab out of the University of Toronto might provide some insight. Here they were looking in Greater Toronto area in collected water from different environments, and found that urban runoff was the dominant and wastewater treatment plant was secondary to that. So getting back to our rivers. All right, so we went kind of from rivers into wastewater treatment plant. We're now coming back out to the rivers. And I just want to remind you that point that we made, right? That we found much higher counts of fibers within the rivers in comparison to what we typically see within the open water of Great Lakes, where fragments, the green shaded here, tend to dominate. So, and what we hypothesize is, right, is that the turbulence of the river keeps these largely negatively buoyant particles afloat, but that they would sink as the river enters the lake and the turbulence diminishes. So we devised a study to kind of examine this hypothesis, focused in on the Milwaukee River Basin. So there are 3 main rivers that flow into that flow through this basin area, and we sampled them at multiple locations down the river. In addition, at every location, we also took sediment samples, and at the areas that are circled, not only did we take surface water samples, but we took samples at various depths, depending upon the depth of the water. So in shallower areas, we could only do maybe 2 nets, so 1 subsurface and 1 at the surface. As we moved and the river got deeper and we moved into the inner harbor and the lake, we were able to take multiple subsurface water samples. And what we found is that basically our hypothesis seems to be correct. We find way more fibers in the water subsurface than we do within the water surface, indicating that the fibers are starting to sink. Even further, when we look at this as a function of polymer density, so our positively buoyant polymers, right, things that have a density less than 1.1 tend to favor the water surface and get smaller, right? There you see less of them in the subsurface and in the sediment, while negatively buoyant polymers, those that have a density greater than 1.1 grams per milliliter, tend to preferentially be found within the sediment as compared to the surface. And I know that there's this foam piece here in the sediment and how that looks weird as compared to the foam that you see at the surface. At the surface, the foam tends to be the expanded polystyrene. I wanted to point out that here, these foam pieces were 97%. These black rubbery particles that were later identified through pyrolysis GCMS to be styrene butadiene rubber, which is commonly associated with tire rubber. So these were and possibly should have been labeled as something other than foam, but they are foamy-like. So they were labeled as foam, but this is a very different kind of foam in the sediment than what you see at the water surface. So again, the point here being, the main kind of point is that the fibers tend to sink as as the water in the rivers flows out into the lake, these particles sink. So then if we look in the lake sediment, what do you think we find? And the lake sediment, it didn't matter. We looked at 2 different lakes, Lake Erie and Lake Michigan. It didn't matter what size, it didn't matter what lake. The dominant morphology are fibers, which are this orangey color in these bar charts.
So you see that fibers dominated most, if not all, of the lake sediment samples. So what does this mean with regard to our biota? As I kind of hinted at earlier, this is a huge knowledge gap with only 6 studies thus far in the Great Lakes region, 3 on fish, 1 on mussels, 1 on cormorants, and 1 hot off the presses on algae. Fibers were the most common morphology of particles within fish and within cormorants, which prey exclusively on fish. And then just like last week, Tim Holian's lab released this very interesting study where they worked with museum archivists and looked at fish archives, so archived fish samples over time. And what they see was that there were no microplastics detected in any fish prior to 1950, but from the mid-century to 2018, microplastic concentration showed a significant increase, especially when you average across all the 4 fish species that they looked at. Fibers were the only particle morphology that they found. Okay, so again, fibers are dominating within the fish, within the cormorants. In contrast, in mussels, you largely find fragments. So kind of some really interesting things happening there with the biota. With regard to algae, another hot off the presses article from Heller et al. Came out last week or earlier this week. I think it came out as I was writing this, my talk for today. They studied Cladorfa, I'm not a biologist, Cladorfa, and found that microplastics readily adsorb onto the algae, possibly for extended periods of time. The adsorbability of the algae seems to be a consequence of the chemical makeup of the cell walls and their high surface area, in addition to being a net-like capture that's demonstrated in both fresh algae and aged algae. They make the point that when this algae dies seasonally, these microplastics are either going to redeposit into the sediment or they could actually be resuspended into the water. So at this point, I think I'm running out of time. So I didn't plan to spend a whole lot of time talking about the impact of the microplastics on humans, but I felt like I would be remiss if I didn't at least mention how everything that we find in the environment comes back to haunt us, humans, in the food that we eat and the air that we breathe. We have engaged in 2 studies looking at human consumables, one that looked at sea salt, beer, and a global tap water assessment, and then a second study that looked at global bottled water with regard to the amount of plastic. This is not a very pretty table. I'm not as good at making pretty graphs as my colleagues. But the point here that is hopefully made is that you find the highest concentrations of microplastics within water, which is what we need, right? It's necessary for life. There was a review article from the Cox et al. Came out in 2019 that looked, reviewed all of the literature on microplastics in things that humans consume. They could only account for 15% of the average American diet. But looking at those studies, again, they found that an average American is going to be ingesting, this is where you hear the credit card worth of microplastic a week, the vast majority of that coming from bottled water and obviously air with regard to inhalation. With regard to the morphology of these particles, I agree, Andy, drink more beer. Beer is better for you. Okay, sorry. I haven't seen much of the chat coming up, but that one caught my attention. With regard to the morphology, so in the beer, sea salt, and tap water study, the vast majority of the particles that we found, 97%, were fibers. I think this is really important to mention I don't know if it's come across yet, if I've made it quite clear, but it seems that fibers are largely coming through atmospheric deposition. So it seems like the source of microplastics in these human consumables is simply coming because these things come in contact with air and deposit things, right? So it's not that water treatment facilities aren't cleaning water, they are, but as soon as that water comes in contact with air, some fibers that are within the air are being transferred. In comparison, in contrast to this, in our bottled water study, fragments were the dominant morphology. And when we looked at the types of polymers, polypropylene, polyethylene, and polyethylene terephthalate were some of the dominant polymers. And this really indicates that it was the act of packaging the water that was leading to most of the microplastic contamination. So it wasn't coming from the air, probably the nylon, the fiber contribution here, that's probably coming from the water itself. But the other things are coming, and additional work since our study came out supports this, that it's the act of packaging things in plastic that leads to the contribution, the dominant kind of contribution of plastic to those human consumables. That's a lot of science. So I wanted to kind of summarize it. And again, my animations are not here, so I'll just walk through it. So with regard to sources, and really with regard to sources here, this is what we're getting from the beach data that we looked at the very beginning, right? Mismanaged waste or litter seems to be one of the dominant sources, with industrial waste like the pre-production pellets being a contributor as well. I didn't even have a chance to mention the flashings that come when we make plastic products and they have to carve, you have these pieces that they have to smooth off. You get these flashings in the water as well. So another industrial type of microplastic. Textiles that's coming from our clothing. And then when we use products that are made out of plastic, so when we're driving and particles come off of our tires, those end up, right? So that's another source of microplastics. In terms of the pathways, runoff seems to be the dominant one, and another hot off the presses study, Morbowski et al. Pointed to this as well, that urban runoff is the dominant, with wastewater treatment plant seeming to be secondary to that. Though regardless of urban runoff or wastewater, both of those are going to be deposited into rivers. And so 80% of the plastics that make their way into the Great Lakes, into the oceans, are making their way there through river systems. The question is, what's the significance with regard to atmospheric deposition? And with regard to the Great Lakes, we have no data on this, right? The best that we have is some kind of circumstantial evidence from the study that we have coming out in Lake Superior, where fibers were the dominant morphology. It's such a big surface area lake that could allow for more atmospheric deposition. And then the work that we have done in the tributaries also showing a high prominence of microfibers, and it didn't matter the population center, it didn't matter the water flow, really seems to indicate that atmospheric deposition is probably the dominant pathway of those fibers into these bodies of water. But the point here is that this is a huge knowledge gap, right? So this really leads us into talking about what are our knowledge gaps with regard to Great Lakes plastic pollution. One is understanding this atmospheric deposition, these major pathways. Still, we need to know more about stormwater versus wastewater, and ideally get data that can allow us to do some mass balance models, and so that we can understand which pathways are the dominant ones, because when it comes to mitigation, those are the ones that you want to focus on. With regard to the environmental compartments, we have especially two where we have very little to no data, right? We have very little data in biota, and we have no data with regard to air. I did not have a chance to talk too much about kinetics, but if you notice in our beach surveys, we have lots of macro items. And in the water, we mostly are seeing these microplastics, which means that there's a lot of degradation that's happening as the litter moves from land to water. And understanding more about what those kinetics look like I think would be really important, especially as we see this push toward changing from these purely synthetic plastics to biodegradable plastics like polylactic acid. Do they actually biodegrade in environmentally relevant ways, or is it just in an industrial landfill? And if it's only in a landfill, or industrial composting facility, if it's only in a composting facility, then are these really any different or any better with regard to environmental impacts than a traditional plastic? And then we still have a lot that we need to understand with regard to the ecological impact. We mentioned the fact that we have lots of fibers in algae and in fish. Are they making their way into the fish through bioaccumulation? If we go to bigger fish, do we find more? Or is it a different kind of thing? And what does this mean for human health impacts? So with that, I think I timed it actually pretty well, despite our technical issues. I want to thank you all for listening to me, for allowing me this opportunity to present to the entire IAGLR audience. It's such an incredible honor. Thank my funding agencies from over the years, and open it up for questions.
Thanks very much, Sam, for an excellent talk, and certainly something that's on all of our radars. And I'm going to say, as you emphasized, and I think our new president emphasized, your results suggest drink the tap water, trust your tap, and possibly drink more beer. Always a good suggestion.
Yeah, I'm not trying to turn us on to alcoholics, but just saying, beer is better.
In our virtual environment, we help celebrate a toast to you for your plenary. We have a few questions here coming through in the chat. So our first question from Francine McCarthy. Francine is asking, I wonder whether pollen traps could be examined to assess atmospheric microplastic influx. Has that been done?
Pollen traps. I mean, I know that there was one study that looked at honey. That's which makes me think of pollen. The most work that's been done with regard to atmospheric deposition has been done by Jane Brainy out of Utah State University, who utilized at the National Atmospheric Deposition Network, so the acid rain sites. So those, where they collect the wet deposition, and that's all archived. So she was able, but at this point in time, she's really only focused in the Western United States. So her and I were just on a symposium a month or two ago, and I reached out to her afterwards. We have lots of common connections, which was a lot of fun to discover. But I was telling her that, I know people out here that are in charge of the acid rain site. So it's something where she wants to explore into the Eastern United States, into the Great Lakes region. We would be all about it. So I think that would be wonderful to do.
Excellent. No, we're good. Certainly, I think the atmospheric component looks from the questions here coming in from an anonymous attendee. The next one is, when looking at wastewater treatment plants, has anybody looked at covered clarifiers versus open air clarifiers? And if airborne fragments are generated from, are there the difference between those two, or that's such a predominant source? No, that possible anonymous attendee would like to have that answered live, if they would like to possibly log in, or if you can give them, unmute them. Hard to find when you're logged in as an anonymous attendee.
They want to know if
open air clarifiers versus covered clarifiers, Sam.
I don't, I think our study is the most, there have been studies that have looked at different places within the wastewater treatment plant. And actually, in order to understand how effective they are at removing microplastics, what's really interesting is that they're actually surprisingly effective, even though that's not what they were designed to do, right? They remove somewhere between 75 and 95% of the microplastics that come in, which is surprising. Of course, when we say remove, they get put into the sludge, right? And oftentimes that sludge is used on agricultural land. So it's really just kind of moving it and therefore allowing it to be released at a different kind of place. So they are surprisingly effective. And still we find that those 4 million particles. I don't know that anybody has sampled from more plants than what we did, and done it in such a way that they could statistically kind of evaluate open air versus closed clarifiers.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think in terms of some of the other pollutants around the Great Lakes, like siloxanes have been that issue as well.
Yeah.
We have some, I was going to say, one of the speakers has their hand up, possibly Harry Nelson, whether that's associated. No, sure. If you want to allow him to speak, that would be great.
Yeah.
Hey, Sam, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hey, great. Wonderful talk. Love the science you're doing and been following it for years and years. Hey, looking at microplastics, he loves you. Thank you. Looking at microplastics either through a microscope, trying to identify them and enumerate them, or any of some of the automated methods that are out there. I mean, how are you doing that?
Yeah,
Tough.
it is tough. I had a whole section on methods, and it's actually at the end of my PowerPoint. But I took it out because I was like, oh, these are Great Lakes researchers. They know how to do this stuff. And I was afraid I would be over time. It is tough, difficult. Yes. So we basically, we collect our samples, we take them through some type of chemical processing. In my lab, we have really preferred the wet peroxide oxidation. With sediment samples, we'll do some density separation in advance of the wet peroxide oxidation. Then we sieve it and enumerate it under using a microscope. So we just count it. Surprisingly, I mean, we did one evaluation where we had two different research students do a blind count and assign, because the morphologies can be surprisingly subjective. And there was some variability, but still they were within 5% of each other in terms of different morphologies. So we're pretty impressed that given, good guidelines, and we have a whole flow chart there on how to assign morphologies, they do pretty well. We do FTIR analysis in our most recent studies, right? Not the first one in 2013, because it wasn't commonplace then, but all of our more recent stuff, so probably starting in 2015 moving forward, we do FTIR analysis confirming usually around 10%, 5 to 10% of the particles. And we've had some unknowns, but I mean, we've been actually surprisingly, I always tell the students to be cautious, so we do the typical thing. If it breaks, we don't count it. If it, that's basically, if it breaks, we don't count it. If we think that there's cellular kind of structure there, we won't count it. So we tend to be very conservative in the lab, and I think that that's been effective. But it is very labor intensive, which is why I thanked all the research students in the acknowledgements. And there are some automated things that are coming up the pipeline that hopefully will help so that we can do more of this research faster. But I know that there's a lot of interest in automating the process, and I'm very hopeful for that. Does that help answer your question?
Yeah. So just kind of to go back just a little bit. So through your digestion process, when you go through the peroxide digestion and sieving, most of all the particles that are left, the vast majority are indeed microplastics?
Oh, I don't know. We don't kind of know. I wouldn't say so, because we just pick through and we find the ones, but we've never counted all of the particles and then how many of them are microplastics. We pick through what is left, because it's not like when you go through the wet peroxide oxidation, you oxidize everything away.
Yeah.
There's always quite a bit of, I always tell the students, like, if it looks like it's kind of still dirty, take it through again. So oftentimes it's kind of a circular process, right? Where you start counting, then there's a lot of gunk still there. So you take it through a wet peroxide oxidation again, and you count it some more. But in terms of, what percentage of the things that are left are microplastics, I don't know that anybody has data on that. Does that help?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
Okay, sure.
Mute myself. Next question's from one of our session chairs, Esteban Chiriboga. Thank you for the excellent talk. Esteban is asking, he's curious about inland lakes and/or impoundments. And also by impoundments, of course, he means behind dams. Do you think these features are sinks for plastic pollution that may have greater contributions? No, actually, Esteban wants to go live and on the line himself as well. If you can find Esteban. So inland lakes or impoundments, Sam, in terms of could they be possibly sinks with, I'll assume slightly higher concentrations is possibly what Esteban's question is.
Yeah, absolutely. And as particles are in the water, biofouling occurs and that causes them to sink. And so you do see, I think I forgot to say, what we find in the sediment is much higher than what you find on the surface water, right? I mean, like orders of magnitude higher, somewhere between, 2 and 6, I think orders of magnitude higher within the sediment than what you see on the surface of the lakes. And that's because of biofouling. And certainly, impoundments like dams, yeah, it's going to stop the flow. And so then that allows for, more of this biofouling to occur. And so you're probably going to see much higher concentrations within the sediment behind a dam than you would on the other side of the dam, right? Because it's blocked those plastics from flowing through. I would think so, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
We'll go to
Napoleon would be the best person to ask that question to. I don't know if he's online, but he'd be the man to ask that. Little shout out to Tim.
the question of toxic chemicals associated with plastics. And Judith Perlinger, our program co-chair, could you tell us about the latest research on what is known with regards to uptake of toxic chemicals associated with plastics and release into biota once they consume plastics? And Judith, we might be able to let her in to chat with you herself. But yeah, the contaminants research, and I know you've done some toxicology work with Ken Brulard, so.
Yeah, I didn't have a chance to really talk about that. It's while I've done some and I'm fascinated by it and I want to do more, it has not been my primary focus, although I am a chemist and like I said, it's a passion of mine. But no, this is to me, my biggest concern with plastics is not the plastic itself, it's the chemicals that are in and on plastics. And these chemicals are known to have human health impacts. They're known to be endocrine disruptors. And if you want to know a lot about this, there's a great book that came out just earlier this year called Countdown by Shauna Swan. She has an entire chapter on plastics. And the subtext for Countdown is, how endocrine disruptors are lowering fertility rates, decreasing sperm counts, and basically working us to the point where we may not be able to reproduce. And so, yeah, so they absorb, as their plastics are out in the environment, they absorb chemicals. They have quite a bit, anywhere from 30 to 70% of the mass of the plastic are chemicals that are added in the manufacturing in order to make them moldable, in order to give them color, in order to make them resistant to UV degradation, all of these different kind of properties. And all of these chemicals have known human health impacts. So, oh yeah, thank you, Jill.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Jill,
Just
for
linked
posting
it.
that.
It's a fascinating book, and that's really the cutting edge. So yeah, there's no doubt that the kind of chemical connection there is really important with regard to what this means for human health, and that's the forefront. And there, I forget, I was just at it watching a talk where somebody was talking about certain chemicals preferentially absorb and certain chemicals preferentially desorb, depending upon the chemical, the plastic, whether it's in the environment or in a living organism. So there's a lot of complications there. Very interesting research to still to be done in that realm, for sure. It's that human health impact that I was talking about.
Well, thanks very much, Sam. There's maybe one more question. I know we're getting tight to the timeline, and I think this one wraps up pretty good. It's from Ben Alsip with the EPA. He said, I'd love to see this and similar research help drive domestic recycling capabilities to create markets for the material here and at home. Any suggestions as to how we make this transition with the research?
Well, okay, to be honest, what I think my research points to is less about recycling and more about reduction. So I want to start there. It's reduce, reuse, then recycle. So I really think, as we're thinking about how to move forward as a society, reduction has to be part of it. And there's a build out happening. I don't know if you know where I live, Pennsylvania. They are turning the Ohio River Valley into the next cancer alley, equivalent to what's happening along the coast of Louisiana, using hydrofracked wet natural gas and turning it into plastics, not just here in Pennsylvania, but using the Mariner East pipeline to ship it to Scotland to make plastics in Europe. So there's this huge build out happening, and as we use less fossil fuels for transportation, what the fossil fuel industry is looking is plastics as plan B. So they plan to build out and to quadruple production in the next 20 years or something like that. It's a lot. So reduction has to be the first thing. And then recycling, then we can talk about recycling. The study I'm going now is really aimed at providing some of the data that can maybe help to drive legislation to help both with the control of litter and with recycling rates. But the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act, call your congressman, tell them to get behind it. That includes forcing companies to have a certain amount of recycled content in their products, and that's how you increase recycling.
Well, thanks very much, Sam. And I think that that's a great point to end on, that it's up to all of us to help move this forward and sort of get towards that plastic-free environment as much as possible. On behalf of the Eigler Program Committee, myself, Judith, and Noel, thank you very much for a wonderful plenary talk. It's an amazing presentation. You're getting lots of accolades here in the comments, Sam. Thanks again for your time, and I certainly hope you have a great holiday booked over the next 2 weeks.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.